Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the American Irish Historical Society. I'm delighted to be able to host this short panel discussion about the recent elections, both in America and in Ireland. To welcome this morning, I have Professor Larry Donnelly, who was a Boston-born lawyer, and then he went to Ireland and has been lecturing in law at University College Galway for several years and is a political commentator. We also have with us Aisling Brady, who is the head of communications for the European movement in Ireland. She was also, interestingly, a delegate here for the US State Department's International Visitors Program, and she spent 3 weeks in the run-up to the American elections visiting different sections in America. So they're both uniquely poised to be able to talk to us about both elections and kind of the fallout, I suppose, and the ramifications for Ireland. So welcome to you both, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank
Great
you,
to be with
Elizabeth.
you.
Thank you very much for having us.
So I suppose if we just start with a kind of a simple question, but it'll set us up. The difference between the two systems. We know Ireland has a proportional representation system and America's is not. So can one of you talk to me about, a proportional representation and what that means? And then we can look at elections in America and why the Electoral College is so important and why sometimes the Electoral College decides a winner who has not actually won the popular vote. Do you want to start with us, Larry, and we'll go to Aisling then?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, thanks to everyone who's tuning in to listen to the discussion, and thanks for having me on. Yeah, it is quite a different electoral system. This is my sixth general election I voted in Ireland since I moved here in 2001, and of course, it took a little while to get used to at the start. But when you vote in a general election in Ireland, it's not a matter of ticking a box for the candidate that you want. In fact, you number the candidates in order of your preference. So you number from, one, two, three, all the way down the ballot paper, if you like. And what happens is that your number one vote will stay with that candidate of your choice until that person is either elected or eliminated. And when that happens, then your number two vote stays with the next candidate, and so forth and so on, all the way down the line. It's called proportional representation, single transferable vote. It's a function of a few things, that Ireland, unlike the United States, is a multi-party democracy. It's not a binary choice typically on the ballot. There were two big beasts in Irish politics, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, but there's a Labour Party, there's a Social Democrats, there's People Before Profit, there's AN2, there's a multiplicity of political parties. And, for those who support the PRSTV method, say that, look, it really gives a more fair and accurate depiction of democracy, that your vote travels a lot more and means a lot more than if you're in the US, where typically you have a binary choice between Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to come in on that, I suppose, and it's wonderful to be with you all today here from Dublin, here in European Movement Ireland. And I suppose just to come in on that, I suppose the diversity that you really see and, in the Irish general election in terms of transfers. So, for example, just to explain to some voters, in some constituencies, because say the likes of Aontú or like Social Democrats, they're much, much smaller parties. So Aontú would be kind of more economically left, but maybe more socially conservative. And then say Social Democrats would be very appealing to like liberal urban demographics. Would be left leaning, but very progressive and liberal on social issues. And I suppose it was really interesting watching some of the transfers, because in Ireland, for example, in some constituencies, you would have seen some transfers go from the likes of the Social Democrats to Aontú, which are very different on social issues. However, maybe economically might have some similar values. So that's the real unique, I suppose, the real uniqueness of the Irish system in comparison to the US. It gives the voter an opportunity to express their political opinion in preference, and maybe certain elements of different parties that an Irish voter can really go and express that throughout the ballot. So whether they want to vote for one or two candidates, they can. There's no specific. They're not tied to voting for one or two people. They can vote from 1 to 10, and that's why counting in Ireland takes so long. When I was in the US, when I was in Iowa, during the US elections, a lot of voting takes place across states electronically, which obviously speeds up the process. Now, here in Ireland, we did try and bring in electronic voting. Here nationally, that was an absolute disaster, and some people believe it's a waste of money. But that's why I suppose it wasn't really until Monday morning that we had a very clear picture of the makeup of the makeup of the outcome of the election. So I suppose again, yeah, the Irish system really allows you to express that diversity of your opinion, or if different parties, if different elements of a party really appeals to you. And I suppose whereas in the US it's so binary, and I suppose that's really what we saw in the US elections. People were so divided along political lines, and that's why we're seeing.
We've lost Aisling for a second. So, Larry, just to comment on that, I suppose, look, that's the big bear in the room for American politics, is that it is really a binary. Like, you had people talking about writing in Jill Stein on certain ballots. She was able to be on the ballot in certain states. Can you talk a little bit about that and, the American system? Is there room for a third party? You're back, actually, that's good. But we're just addressing that binary now. Larry's going to comment on the binary.
Yeah,
On the binary.
just one thing to supplement the points that Aisling was making there. The other distinction I think that's an important one here is that we have multi-seat constituencies. So it would be as if in the United States Congress, which I suppose is most akin to Dáil Éireann, if we're to look at it that way, you have one seat for one constituency, whereas in Ireland you have multiple seats in each constituency, 3, 4, or 5, depending on its size. So that creates a different dynamic. But yeah, I mean, the fact is, the United States, it is a binary choice. People like me would argue that that binary choice results from a ultimately cozy relationship between the leaderships of the Democratic and Republican parties, such that they control the process, they control the money, which means a tremendous amount in American politics. So we've seen, people attempt to break the two-party system in the United States. But because of that stranglehold, and in particular because of the pernicious role that money plays in American politics, I don't think there's any chance, at least not in my lifetime, that we'll see a break of the two-party system. It just the will isn't there. And the odd thing in that context is that both the Democratic and the Republican parties have drifted to the polls. Democrats have moved considerably to the left. Republicans have moved considerably to the right. So there is a very big swathe of Americans who don't feel best represented by either party. And as a result, when they vote, they're typically voting for the lesser of two evils. So there is a gap in the market there for sure. But again, for the reasons I've said, and I've said a million times, I just don't see that stranglehold enjoyed by the Democrats and Republicans breaking anytime soon.
I think it's become apparent in the last couple of elections, as you say, the widening gulf. And yet, you hear people push back this time that, when Kamala Harris lost the campaign, that they tacked too left. She ran a very, kind of leftist, radical left agenda. I mean, the woman admitted she owned a gun. She's kind of fiscally conservative. It's interesting to me that, sometimes I think the Democrat is such a big tent that they can't keep everyone inside happy, but we might be fooling ourselves about how radically left, particularly Kamala Harris's policies were in relation to maybe somebody like AOC or Bernie Sanders, even, who I know is not a card-carrying Democrat. But, have the Democrats really reckoned with their own tendency to the middle,
I think that, having been in Iowa on election night, I think that the Democrats, I was talking to chair of the Democratic Party in Polk County, they really have lost middle America. They are not connected with middle America. They are, I think for middle America, they feel that, yes, they're very successful on the West Coast and the East Coast, but middle America, that message isn't reaching them. And that's why we saw such a sweep across the board towards Trump. And the economy, that tagline, the economy's stupid. I don't think the Democratic campaign focused in enough on that. I mean, abortion as a headline issue, obviously it was a key issue, a headline issue, and particularly for many women, but it wasn't the issue for everybody, because we know that there are pockets of America that are very conservative on the issue. And then there's obviously probably the middle ground who are a bit more mixed on it. But it was really clear to me in Iowa that the Democrats have not managed to connect with middle America. And going forward, in order to be electorally successful, they do need to find a way. And even in Iowa, for the presidential election, the Democrats did not host their presidential caucus there, which is the normal tradition. The Republicans did. And I suppose that was Iowans were sore about that because that is the tradition. That has always been, the case for many, many years. The Democrats had moved out of that. They wanted to go to a more diverse state. So I think that that's the biggest lesson and the biggest learning. And talking to Bill Barr, who's the chair of the Democratic Party there in Polk County, he feels that quite strongly, and he's trying to feed that back into the Democratic Party. But again, as Larry was saying, money and I suppose the media and trying to really, I suppose AOC is quite a vocal Democrat, that kind of section of the Democratic Party. That image is really there. That's not connecting with Middle America. So the Democrats really need a post-mortem and to find a way that can satisfy, because they still need to keep obviously the West Coast and the East Coast, because a liberal tradition is strong. Liberal values are still strong in the Democrats, but they need to find a way to connect with Middle America because it's really apparent that that didn't happen in this election.
Yeah. Larry, do you want to respond to that? I just to kind of facilitate the conversation, I think it was interesting that women actually kind of broke with them. Like you could see that they voted for Trump in certain states, but actually did vote in maybe Democrats. So, the abortion issue was maybe they're kind of safeguarding it at the state level because they have a Democrat governor or whatever, but they still voted for Trump. And then the other thing that I wanted to ask, like, is Iowa representative of a modern America? So like maybe the Democrats were right to move out of using that state as the first caucus, Larry.
Well, the first point that I think doesn't get made often enough is that women are often seen as completely homogenous on the issue of abortion. If you look at the opinion polling, indeed opinion polling from earlier this year, post the reversal of Roe versus Wade, fully 1/3 of American women believe that abortion should be illegal in all or most cases. So you're starting there from a base of 2/3 of women who are going to be with you on the abortion message. And no question that is a winning message for the Democrats, but they arguably over-egged it because the people who felt very strongly about Roe versus Wade being reversed, they were never going to vote for Donald Trump or any Republican from the first place. The people they had to reach out to were the people who would have a middling view of abortion, people who think that, yes, it needs to be legal, but it's kind of a necessary evil. Instead, they led with abortion, and the only topic that Kamala Harris was consistently articulate on was, as she framed it, reproductive rights. And I don't think that sat well with an awful lot of people in the places that Aisling has been describing. They came to perceive them as a party that caters to the interests of people on the coast who are well-heeled and for whom typical bread and butter Democratic issues aren't as central too. The other point about Iowa, there's a number of reasons why the caucuses weren't held on the Democratic side this year. One reason for that is because of what you said, that arguably Iowa is not representative of America's diversity, and as such played a disproportionate role. The other cynical reason, and to be blunt, was if you look back to 2020, Joe Biden came in 5th in Iowa. Joe Biden came in 4th in New Hampshire. Joe Biden was on life support until South Carolina. And I hate to be cynical, but what was the first state that actually counted this year? South Carolina. So again, I would put that point here. But in terms of states that may be unrepresentative or may not look like the coast, because of the electoral system in the United States, Democrats have no choice but to appeal to people in what it was pejoratively referred to sometimes as flyover territory. Because of the machinations of the Electoral College, it plays a very, very big role in who gets elected as president of the United States. And that's why the Democrats' leap to the left on cultural issues has been such a dramatic political mistake. And there's lots of debates, you say about a reckoning or a post-mortem. And the debate has been framed in the past few years by the media, especially, as something like the Obama wing and the Clinton wing versus the AOC wing. I would dispute that very strongly. What I think the future to Democratic success is more of a marriage between the Bernie Sanders wing, that is populist on economic issues and things like college education, affordability, and all that sort of thing. And I know his name is not popular in Democratic circles, and Joe Manchin from West Virginia, a conservative Democrat who got elected in a state that Donald Trump won by 30 and 40 points. each time. A marriage between those two schools of thought, that is, economic populism with social moderation. That is the path for Democrats. And the last person we saw that do that very well was Bill Clinton. Remember Bill Clinton's rhetoric on some of the hot button cultural issues? It was, yes, I'm on your side, progressives, but also we're a big tent and we appeal to more than those who are in New York or who are in California.
So that
Yeah, I
then,
do.
go
Sorry,
ahead.
just coming in on that, and I do think, a lot of the left of the party, I suppose, those who celebrate Democrats really being strong and liberal probably won't be too happy with that. But when I talk about Middle America, I referenced Iowa. I was there, on the ground, but I mean more generally, more broadly, Middle America, not just Iowa in and of itself. Yes, it may not be truly represent America, but remember, the Electoral College is ultimately what gets you elected president of the United States. And we saw such a red sweep across all of Middle America, most of Middle America. And I think that's really, really important. I do think for the Democrats to marry that mix of, if it is Bernie Sanders and if it is Joe Manchin, I think that's going to be a hard sell to a lot of the Democrats. I think a lot of people will be up in arms about it, but I do think some tilt towards the middle, but not. I think Democrats still, I think, into the future to keep kind of the East Coast, the West Coast there. I still think those liberal values still have to be part of what the Democrats offer, but maybe more of a softening towards more conservative Democratic voters who would have cared more about bread and butter issues, who would have cared more about trade unions. And it was actually really interesting when I was in Iowa. I was at a rally for the Democrats the night before the election. There was a candidate, Dan Backen, running for Zach Nunn's seat. So he basically was the challenger for the incumbent for Congress, one of the Congress seats there. And it was really interesting to hear him talk about unions and the importance of unions. So those kind of issues, I think, can resonate with maybe traditional Democratic voters, who maybe people like in the likes of New York, who support Democrats would also, support those kind of policy platforms, unionization, workers' rights, just those bread and butter issues. But cost of living, I think, really was such a big issue that Trump really capitalized on in terms of the economy. And people, I was outside a polling station and in West Des Moines in Iowa, and talking to people coming out again and again, and even just going over there trying to buy a coffee, is $6. Like, I mean, the cost of living in Ireland is high. In America, it's colossal. It's so high, and ordinary people are really struggling with that. And I think when you watch, despite Kamala Harris's overall positive narrative, I think her campaign, she ran it really well. Standing back and looking at it is very positive when you're kind of watching her. And when I was in Washington at the rally, she had a huge rally there with over 775,000 people there. It was incredible to be at. And her message was positive. She was talking about unity. Yes, she did headline reproductive rights. But again, on the economy, there was less of a focus on that. There was less of a vision for the future where Americans were going to be better off, and a really coherent plan put forward. And I do think that's probably what Americans really wanted. And listening to people coming out of the polling station, that was coming up again and again. And some of those who were happy to talk to me about supporting Trump were saying, when Trump was in office, I feel I was better off, and I feel that he'll be able to handle the economy better. And I think the Democrats, that's really where they let themselves down, just showing that vision that yes, things have been difficult. We've come through a pandemic, there's high inflation at the moment, but this is how we're going to tackle it.
Right.
Because successful elections are always about the promises that you can make into the future. And I think that was a big gap in the campaign, as people realized.
Do we not think
their pockets.
That there's kind of a disconnect between the reality, and the perception or the feeling? I feel poor, unemployment is lower now. Like, there are statistics to kind of argue that the economy is better now than it was under a Trump campaign. You can argue that, do we really know any of Trump's economic policies other than this idea to slap on tariffs, which is naturally going to make goods more expensive for American consumers? Is there a gap, Larry, in the electorate's understanding of issues or are your feelings more important than what's actually the bottom line? Or like, have wages stagnated? I guess that's, they have in certain sectors.
Well, there always has been a gap between, what the reality is and what the perception is. And part of that is because people feel and experience life on a daily basis. The top line figures don't mean an awful lot to them. It matters what they can afford on a day-to-day basis and how their family is doing. That's a huge part of it. The other thing in terms of, the messaging, is that unfortunately, from the Democrats' point of view, there was a message to be sold. As you indicate, the inflation figures have been coming down. The number of presentations at the southern border, something a lot of Americans are concerned about, those have come down. But regrettably for the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris proved to be a very weak messenger. She just couldn't get that across. And yes, she was strong when delivering speeches, strong when she was on a teleprompter, but she was dreadful and even trying to grapple with the most simple, straightforward requests. And she never seemed to get through those messages on the economy, on immigration, and regrettably, from a Democratic point of view, given that she was up against it anyway, Trump had a huge advantage against the Biden-Harris administration of which she was a part, given that she didn't get into the race until very late, only 100 or so days, and then given that she ran what was, in my view, a dismal campaign, I can't say I'm terribly surprised by the outcome.
Yeah. Aisling, just to bring this into Ireland, and you mentioned Aontú earlier on, there is, it seems, a sort of a push to the right on some of the social issues in both countries. Like Ireland is seeing a surge in anti-immigration protests, particularly in the city, Dublin. But also maybe even some pushback to, Aontú, like, are kind of against the repealing of the Eighth Amendment. And, Ireland is very proud of itself for being the first country to vote in democratically same-sex marriage. Can you talk about this, and particularly in the Irish situation, that there's a left-leaning, kind of socialist or democratically socialist economic policy, and yet there is a kind of a conservative socialist social thing happening?
Well, actually, conservative kind of more socialist model is really what Aontú are now. Aontú only have 2 seats in the Dáil.
Yeah.
Now they did do well in the election, and they are now entitled to state funding, given how they've performed in the election. I would still say that obviously abortion only came into Ireland in 2018. I would still like most of the main parties would all would be supportive of abortion, but it was interesting in our election, kind of the cultural issues didn't really come up, like the issue of abortion didn't come up at all. And now Aontú are a pro-life party, but again, I suppose I would just couch that there are only 2 sitting TDs, in a Dáil of 174. Now there are some independents who are more conservative on the issue, who are conservative, who are pro-life. But I would say, the big parties, they would still very much so have a strong platform in favour of the current abortion regime in Ireland, which is up to 12 weeks. And then there are exceptions, within the legislation as well. So I would say that probably Ireland will be more, at this point anyway. Obviously America is very, very diverse. It depends on what state, it depends on what state you're in. New York is obviously totally different to the likes of Florida. But overall, I would still say that there is that, buy-in and that support there for the likes of, abortion.
And what about the anti-immigration movement?
That's at a different stage, I think it was very much so at the forefront, like every day, when I was in the US for 3 weeks, as, many of your, viewers who've tuned in here, abortion was, you couldn't avoid the issue every day. Remember, there were referendums across 10 states where 7 passed, where, 7 of the states passed were in favor of a more liberal regime, and that was proposed on the ballot, and 3 obviously objected. Florida being one of them. But I think, in the US, there has been a much broader discussion about abortion that, in Ireland, it's still a very new issue. And I would say broadly, most people are in favor of, obviously,
what we now have. Yeah.
They would be in favor of the provision, the term limits now in the US and some of the states are much further, much later into the term. In Ireland, it's up to 12 weeks, and then there are, of course, exceptions. But that issue did not come up in the general election. It wasn't an election issue. In the US, you could not escape it. It was every day.
Okay. And then will you just
having conversations with people about it constantly, or just out in the street?
I just want to move on actually to the immigration thing, particularly in Ireland, the anti-immigration movement. Can you talk about that? How visible was that argument in the Irish election?
So in terms of immigration, it was really interesting in the general election. I do think both of the major parties managed to kind of get a better handle on it. During the European elections, or just in the lead up to it, there were a lot of tents in Dublin City, and with a lot of people seeking international protection, and it caused uproar. There were tents along Grand Canal. It really kind of sparked a huge debate in Ireland about it. Now there are a lot of far right activists in Ireland, or people who are very strongly anti-immigrant, but there's still, I suppose, more of a fringe political movement. Now in Coolock, which is an area in Dublin, which probably some of your viewers are quite familiar with, openly declare my mom is from Coolock, and I know all my mom's family are from there, so I know the area really, really well. And there was huge protests that got international attention. Huge protests, as there was a plan to place those seeking international protection in a Crown factory. So Crown is like a paint company. It's a disused factory. And a lot of the neighborhood went out, and protested. Some people were genuine, I'd say a lot of those people were just genuinely concerned, had concerns about a lot of people moving into, a factory. They were just concerned about the change in the area, whatever issues, local issues coming up.
Actually, can I just clarify? These are refugees, though, right? Like they've been granted refugee status by the UN. They're not illegal immigrants.
International protection applicants. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, but there was a lot of racism. There were riots. There was violence. It was huge on the news. A really great investigation piece was done by RT. And investigates. That encourage any of you to go on RT and take a look. Barry Cummins, you can actually follow the reports on the ground. So to say that, in Ireland, there is a lot of concern in some communities about the issue of immigration. I do think that the government kind of saw this mood and saw what was happening, and have changed their messaging. In particular, Fine Gael, they kind of began to be a bit more hard. I wouldn't say it was hardline, but tougher on the issue of immigration. For example, Ukrainian refugees coming to Ireland, we took in over 100,000. That's quite significant. That's a lot of people. And we would have given them, a over 200 euro weekly allowance, but that has been cut now to 38 euros. So things are changing. But it was interesting over the general election. It wasn't a big headline issue that was constantly debated. It was coming up on doors in communities, but it wasn't that zeitgeist issue that everybody was talking about. Not in the way of the US, but the Migration Pact, which comes from an EU level, will be implemented in 2025. So it is something that we're going to have to monitor and see what happens. But just on the question of Aintu, they would be, they're not anti-immigrant, but they would still advocate for, I suppose, strong borders, that kind of language. There was talk. Peadar Tóibín is the leader. He's quite well known in opposition. He was talking about an Irish sea border. So there was a special here with leaders from all the political parties. So as you can imagine, for Americans, you might only have two, but this had about 10 different leaders, or sorry, I think it was 8. There was an immigration special. There was a discussion on it with Katie Hannon, which is on RT, and that's also available for you to watch if you're interested in this issue in an Irish context. And you'll get a sense of all the different leaders' perspectives. But, an Irish sea border was kind of what the Aintu party were putting forward. But again, that was kind of really challenged, and how feasible that would be, because obviously there's an open border north and south, and that's what the Irish government campaigned for really strenuously during Brexit. But this discussion isn't going away, but it wasn't the issue during the general election.
Okay. Larry, can you come in on this? Like, it's very ironic for a country that has literally spread its people to every corner of the world in one way. And yet, on the other hand, I believe the figures are somewhere like 1 in 7 people living in Ireland is, what they call a non-national or an outsider. you know, I mean, we have this debate in America. We all know that immigrants are often the entrepreneurial class. Even a refugee, if given the opportunity, will eventually open a business so immigrants tend to not be usually a drain on the services of a country if they're able to, take part in that country. How do you think Ireland is handling this?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. The first thing, just to quickly to jump back quickly on the abortion issue, the fact is the abortion issue didn't feature at all in the general election campaign. And got 2 seats, but if you look at two avowedly pro-choice parties, Labor and the Social Democrats, they both had terrific general elections. So the abortion issue, at least for now, has sort of been put to bed in Ireland, and it's kind of remarkable that the United States has gone in one direction and old Catholic conservative Ireland has gone in the different direction. So that's one thing. The immigration issue here was interesting, and people like me thought at one stage that it would be a big issue in the general election campaign. The fact is, the exit polls showed that only 6% of the public said it was the key issue for them in voting. It receded dramatically from the stage, whereas it was shaping up to be an issue. We had the riots in Dublin last year. There's no question but that it was an issue in the local and European elections. Earlier, we saw a handful, not as many as possible, but a handful of far-right agitators on the immigration movement, get council seats at local level. And we saw one come reasonably close to getting a seat at European level. But that all having been said, there is a truth here. This country and anyone who's visited recently has changed dramatically, dramatically in a very short space of time. The collective skin complexion of Ireland has darkened considerably, in recent years, and that's because there has been a tremendous amount of immigration here, legal immigration in most instances. And that, by and large, is a good thing. But we would be very unusual if there wasn't some resistance around that, if there wasn't some questioning around it. And where it comes to the fore is the fact is, and many people watching this will know, is that immigration is inextricably intertwined with the biggest crisis in this country, and that is housing. And it's my view that if housing weren't such an issue, that we would be even more against the trend. That is, there is no real right-wing anti-immigrant party in Ireland, as there is in virtually every other European country. We've really bucked the trend, but in my view, we'd be bucking the trend completely. I don't think immigration would really surface if it weren't for a pre-existing housing crisis and a sense among the people. And I understand this at one level. People who say, we can't even house our own, and now we have all these people coming in here looking for housing. That is a reasonable question. That's not a racist question. That is a reasonable question to ask. And as Aisling says, I think the parties of the center, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, have moved adroitly to address that concern in a grown-up, civil, open fashion. I think that it's paid political dividends, and I think that's why it's receded as an issue. And the other interesting thing here is if you look at the past 2 or 3 years in Irish politics, the big story a year and a half ago or 2 years ago was Sinn Féin and how they were dominating the polls and running way ahead of both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. Then all of a sudden, immigration came on the scene, and Sinn Féin effectively imploded. Well, then again, as immigration receded as an issue, as the focus got back on housing, got back on other things, as I think it did during the general election, Sinn Féin actually had, all things considered, a decent election. It was a much, much better performance than they put in the local and European elections, where they had only 11% of the vote. They now have 39 seats. They have more seats than Fine Gael, which I don't think anyone would have predicted 2 months ago.
Even though, Larry, I think their vote share did fall, since 1990, kind of in this general election, so some people are saying it's kind of, while yes, they have more seats than Fine Gael, like this is their trajectory ended now. maybe.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's been the analysis, and I have to say, I take
Yeah.
vigorous issue with it. And I say that as somebody who is not a Sinn Féin supporter at all. You have
Mhm.
to look at this, in terms, if you, it depends on what you want to look at as your starting point, right? 2020, when they had an amazing election, was an aberration. It was absolutely freakish. We had candidates who were on holidays who got elected. Some of those candidates who this time around ran again and got less than 1% of the vote. If you look at it from the point of view, let's take the long game. In 2002, Sinn Féin had 5 seats in Dáil Éireann. They now have 39. If
Yeah.
you look at where they were a few months ago, when they were at 11% in the locals, where scandals were all over the place, scandals in which the very nature, all the suspicions and all the doubts about who really runs Sinn Féin were brought to the fore and in the public mind, where you had Mary Lou McDonald, their top performer, still a formidable politician, basically off the pitch for a year because of personal and health issues and all sorts of other things. And you looked at it, and in her absence, you had the division in the party, that is between the more liberal progressive wing and the wing that wants to pivot on immigration to the right. When you had those clashes all over the place, and you look at the scandals, as I mentioned, and you say at the end of the campaign, they still have more seats than Fine Gael, despite everything you said, despite the share of the vote decline, et cetera. You have to say this was not a bad election result for Sinn Féin. Not great, but not bad either.
And
Yeah,
Aisling, who do
so
you think, I just because I'm conscious of time, what in terms of the next government in Ireland, like, do you think Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael will go back into coalition together? Will somebody reach out to Sinn Féin? They're working quite well with Sinn Féin in the north of Ireland. Of course, Sinn Féin are, lead party in Stormont. So what do you think, Aisling, will happen in terms of forming an Irish government, and how quickly do they need to do that in order to be able to deal with a Trump presidency in January?
yeah, to be honest with you, in terms, the Dáil is going to be back sitting on the 18th of December.
Mm.
So one certainty, once I suppose the two coalition parties, I think, are a certainty for government. I just with the left, unfortunately, while they, the left of Irish politics in Ireland, so Sinn Féin, Labour, the likes of People Before Profit, Social Democrats, they have yet to really form a cohesive bloc and really challenge the likes of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. Even
And
in the
actually
election,
being in government really cost the
and
Greens, you could
actually
argue.
being
Yeah.
in government. So
Mm.
it will be Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. It's just a question of now they have 86 seats between them. To
Hmm.
lead a coalition in Ireland, you need 88. So they are very comfortable together. I mean, on a policy platform, it shouldn't be too complicated to iron out a program for government. But I suppose the key question is who is going to be their coalition partner? Now, the
Yeah.
Social Democrats, who we've already spoken about, they're a young, liberal, progressive, kind of a socialist ideology, a party. They aren't seen as a reliable coalition partner. So it more points to the experienced Labour, who'd be very actually similar to Social Democrats in many ways, but obviously they're the oldest party in Ireland. They have a tradition of government, but the last time they served, they were absolutely obliterated.
Yeah.
And like the Green, or should we say like the Green now, there's one
Mm.
Green party member. So obviously they had a huge boost in the last election in 2020. They had 11 seats, but now they're
Mhm.
down to 1 seat. The leader is the last man standing, essentially,
Yeah.
for the Green Party. So, and in fairness to the Greens, both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael really did hammer hard on them kind of during the election campaign. They strategically used them to blame a lot, blame them a lot for maybe some of the government's difficulties or challenges. And we've seen a total wipeout of the Green Party. So for any small party considering going in, like Labour, it's a big consideration for members. They've just recovered. They were in government in 2011. They've just recovered. They have 11 seats now, which is very healthy for them. So the question is, do they go in? But then, in 5 years' time, 4 years' time, do they get shafted again? Or, is this an opportunity to really affect change in government? As, technically when you are elected, you should aim to lead. And being in government in Ireland is where the power is. And if you want to make change, make a difference, we have seen the smaller coalition party really have a great influence on policy. And that's what politics is about. It's about
Yeah.
delivering policies to make a difference in people's lives. But
Yeah.
then there's also the big I suppose those who are really looking potentially like they're going to form a coalition could be the independents. They might be more easy to work with, given the fact that a lot of independents are formerly members of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They would be of that gene pool. They would have maybe some very similar, views and policy
Policies.
perspectives on different issues. So that that could really be who are the next government. And the irony is that if it is Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and independence, that was very similar to the makeup of the government when Donald Trump was last in power in the US. It was confidence and supply with Fine Gael, independence, and Fianna Fáil supporting that government. So it'll be interesting to see over the next few days how that fares out. This is a really, really crucial time for talks. It's just at talks at the moment. But I suppose we probably won't see, I don't think we will see a government formed until, the new year. I just can't see everything being flashed out. I'd say a lot of politicians are tired. They probably want a break, but I would say that by the end of January, they will have to have a government in place because obviously with the Trump presidency coming in, it's very serious.
Okay, so I know we have to cut this off in a couple of minutes, but I just wanted to ask you to bring it back to America, Larry. Do you think there exists, an Irish American voting bloc still? We've talked a little bit about, the move to the right. J.D. Vance's book a couple of years ago, A Hillbilly Elegy, sort of explained partly maybe why working class people or blue collar, many of whom, of course, would be Irish American, traditionally Democrats, maybe. But, we saw this year the Teamsters Union, for instance, not a single Republican voted to protect the Teamster pension, and yet 80% of Teamsters voted Republican. So do you think Irish America exists as a bloc? And if it does, where do they fall on Trump?
Well, certainly nationally, I don't think they exist as a bloc. Are they still a force in certain areas of the United States? Yeah, I think that's true. I think Irish America can unite around some issues. I think one of those, for instance, was in the aftermath of Brexit, where we saw congressional Republicans and Democrats of Irish heritage banding together and basically converting the position of the Congressional Irish Caucus into the position of the President of the United States, which I think was an extraordinary testimony to the remaining power of Irish America. But no, I don't think it's homogenous. It's heterogeneous, but that doesn't mean it's not influential in lots of different ways. It's also influential, as you indicated, as a barometer of the Catholic vote more broadly. And I think that's a fascinating one to watch. If you look at Donald Trump's numbers this year with Catholics, Joe Biden was very competitive when it came to Catholics. It was nearly 50-50 when it was him versus Trump. Donald Trump won that demographic clearly this year. So I think that they're still there. Irish America is still a powerful entity. There are still issues on which they will rally around. There always has been a disconnect between blue collar Irish America, in sense of sometimes they'd vote for candidates who mightn't be as good for their wallets or their pocketbooks as they should have been. They're persuaded by other issues. America remains sort of unique in the world in the sense that a lot of people do vote on the culture wars first and foremost, and that can lead them to make sort of decisions that are against their economic self-interest. So yeah, I mean, I'm still rosy and confident about Irish America, but it is going to be split. It is going to be an important barometer. And I think one of the things to look for to the future, and this goes beyond Irish America, is Latinos and Hispanic Americans. And what's happening, and this is devastating for the Democratic Party, to be frank with you, is that based on the numbers we're seeing and the trend we've seen emerge over a number of years, a trend that predates Trump indeed, Latinos are gravitating towards the Republican Party in significant numbers. And the reality is that Latino Americans are actually going to be much more like Irish Americans in terms of their voting preferences than they are like African Americans. And Democrats took that group of people for granted for too long, and they need to do some serious outreach on that front. But the last thing I want to say about Irish American, I think it's important to say this as President Biden leaves office, and lots of people here and there are wondering, are we ever going to have somebody who's so proud of his Irish roots back in the White House? And my response to that immediately is, yes, I do think that there will be, but you all better be ready because he or she could just as well be a conservative Republican as a left of center Democrat. And I think it's really important that in terms of the Irish-American relationship, especially now with Trump coming in, that the efforts of the Irish government, of Irish business, of Irish diplomats to engage with people on both sides of the aisle, not to vest all their hopes in Democrats, is really, really important. Never more so than it is right now, given the number of Irish Americans in Trump's inner circle. This is important, and there's an awful lot at stake for this country in that vein. And I think to be honest, just to return quickly to the Irish election, I think that was in the background of an awful lot of people's minds as they voted this time. And I think that the reason why, for all their flaws, and people would say Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have lots of flaws, they'd say right now we need stability. And perhaps even if they're not the biggest fans of them, the devil you know is better than the ones that you don't. And that's why I say, with a government, to my way of thinking, ready to be made with independence, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael should form the government and get up and running as soon as possible. The public won't thank them if they dilly-dally and take a long time, because they know in a climate of global instability, they want a stable government. That's what they voted for.
Do you want to speak on that?
Yeah, and I think Micheál Martin, we know he's pragmatic. He's very experienced. Who is the leader of Fianna Fáil, who's set to be, pretty much set to be the next Taoiseach. He will be the one going to the White House in March for St. Patrick's Day, which will be a huge momentous day again for Ireland. And they obviously have to play their cards right. They have to. And I do think it's really, really important. What's at stake for Ireland is very serious, given the fact that Donald Trump's, Secretary for Commerce has name-checked Ireland. He has specifically referenced the profits generated here through corporation tax and how the US is losing out on that. I don't know what more is a bigger warning to government. And speaking to officials here, they are very concerned because in Ireland, we are very still heavily reliant on corporate tax. That is the bread and butter of how our economy is functioning. And that is very serious for us because we are so reliant on it. And also from an EU perspective as well, there is a pressure point there. Now we have signed up to the OECD agreement. So in Ireland, profits over 750 million are taxed at 15%. We have retained 12.5% corporate tax for profits below 750 million. But that issue is very crucial for the Irish government. And I do think going to the polls, a lot of people said, thought about, kind of crises that have come and gone, like Brexit, like the pandemic, and the government, for all its ills, has steered us through these times. But Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, having been in the US, they do need to, and I would really echo Larry's comments, work both sides of the aisle, because I suppose the Republicans, having spoke to them on the ground, there's such a strong connection with Ireland for many Republicans, and that's something that we don't celebrate here, because Ireland traditionally would be very supportive of Democrats and presidents, but as well as that, I think going with the Irish-US relationship as well, with the ongoing war between Israel and Gaza. Obviously, thank God we saw the ceasefire with Lebanon. But that is a bit of a bone of contention as well there. And I do think it's probably best place, given those specific issue, a very different perspective on foreign policy. At the moment, during that work, Ireland would want to be one of the most vocal on that issue, and and supportive of Palestine. Like, the government has committed to enacting the Occupied Territories Bill, which basically will ban trade in the occupied territories. So in Palestine. So there are definitely big differences there, and there's tensions to be managed there. So going to the polls, it's clear that did play into some of the vote that we see, with Fianna Fáil getting 48 seats, which is quite significant, and Fine Gael getting 38. So that's 86 out of a full government of 88. So it'll be interesting to monitor things over the next few days, but we do need stability in these times. And, even looking across to France and the instability there, Michel Barnier was only appointed president not too long ago. With all the geopolitical tensions, and Europe has really tilted to the right. So Ireland is a bit of an outlier in the world at the moment, with a very centrist coalition. And, incumbents have kind of, in the Super Bowl year of election, incumbents actually haven't fared too well. So Ireland is still quite unique in the political landscape. And and I suppose 2025, there will be a lot of political uncertainty. So definitely to get a government enacted, at least, together to form a government in January, I think will be very, very important. I do think people won't be too happy if it's running into February, or just kind of seen to get a coalition together just before March, before Washington happens. The big day for St. Patrick's Day, people won't be too happy with that.
Yeah. So that's kind of a sobering end. Any final thoughts, Larry, on where both nations stand and how we can, continue the relationship going forward? That's Aisling has raised a lot of interesting points there, particularly, I suppose, about Gaza. We clearly differ on those, how America sees it and how Ireland sees it. So that definitely is a bone of contention, I think.
Yeah, there's no question about that. Whenever I'm asked to identify the biggest difference between, I suppose, outlook and approach between Ireland and the United States, I used to say climate change and how seriously the threat of climate change was taken collectively by the government was the biggest difference. But now I think it's very clear that attitudes towards Israel and the Middle East are the biggest. And I think what people here in Ireland were really shocked by was how little time and how little space Gaza was given and in the American presidential election, and despite conjecture to the contrary, how little it actually mattered in the end. Whereas in this country, it is certainly a motivating factor for a very big swathe of the electorate. So that is going to have to be something that we work around. We're not going to be able to see eye to eye, and that it's just not going to happen. We're going to have to work around that one. It's one of many challenges that present itself. But one of the striking things, just maybe for me to finish talking on, is, I think that the result of this election in Ireland is, again, it's, totally against what is happening in so many other countries in the year of the election. And I think it's I would pay tribute, to be frank, to the Irish electorate for, I suppose, a path of caution, or taking a path of caution, because it is an uncertain world, an uncertain climate right now. In terms of what's ahead in the United States, look, it's a society, and it brings me no pleasure to say this, it's a society with a lot of very serious issues and problems. I think one of the manifestations of that is desperation and anger. And I think a lot of people have vested an awful lot of hope in Donald Trump on that front, and he is emboldened, and he has, whether you agree with him or not, his agenda is quite radical, and where that's going to lead, we'll see. We'll see how much he gets done. We'll see how hard he pushes, but certainly it only heightens an already very uncertain global climate. And because Ireland is so exposed to what happens around it, there's a lot of things we need to be wary of.
Yeah. Aisling, final thoughts from you?
I think the big takeaway for any political observers, particularly in an Irish context, is that you're going to see a lot of new faces in the Dáil, and potentially in the Seanad as well. Fine Gael, 17 people through either retirement or deciding for personal reasons they're going to leave politics. So we've got a lot of new names in the Dáil. So it's going to be really interesting now listening to debates going forward. There's a lot of people who are first-time politicians. Some people, obviously have a lot of experience, in the council and things like that. But in terms of procedure, protocol, it's going to be a deep dive, a big learning curve for them. And so it's going to be interesting to see. And there's a lot of new talent, and I think that that's going to be interesting to observe as well. And remember, we're talking about Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, particularly on the Fine Gael side. There's a lot of new faces there. So that's going to be a challenge for Simon Harris in terms of who to elevate to cabinet position. And it'll be interesting to see who will be in cabinet in this term. So that's definitely one to watch, just on this side of the aisle, and this side of the world, over the next while. But definitely a lot of new faces, and I'm actually very curious to see how they perform, into the future. And and that ain't too for anyone interested in that party. It's a young guy called Paul Lawless. He's from Knock in County Mayo. So Padatobin finally has a friend in the Dáil, and the Social Democrats and Labour, as Larry was saying, did really, really well. So again, they're to the left. They're progressive parties. Now, Social Democrats have been much, much younger. But it'll be interesting to see because there's a lot of new talent in both of those parties as well. So I think it'll be an interesting time ahead, and sure, politics is never a dull day, is it?
Yeah, that's it, exactly.
There's so much on that note, yeah.
Yeah, and I think Irish people and even Irish Americans, we are a politicized nation, the Irish, and whether you thank Daniel O'Connell or the monster meetings, it was one of the strengths they brought with them as immigrants to America was their political awareness and kind of instincts, and how to rally people. And so, we might have to come back and revisit things, particularly when we see the Trump government in action and how various economic policies play out, even some of the overseas roles. It's interesting, like the Irish, ambassadors and things are kind of career diplomats, whereas here it's a political appointee, so it could change the tenor completely of a relationship depending on the administration. But I want to thank you both for joining me, and I really appreciate it, and hopefully, as I say, we'll come back again in the future to kind of catch up. But thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth.